I mean, you always think you've seen the worst the world has to offer after a decade of wearing a trident on your chest, but then you move into a suburban cul-de-sac and realize that evil doesn't end oppos. T always wear a combat uniform. Sometimes it wears a floral print dress and carries a clipboard. I'd spent 10 years as a Navy SEAL, most of that time in places where the air smells like diesel and dust. And when I finally decided to hang it up, all I wanted was a place where the only thing I had to worry about was whether the local coffee shop had fresh beans. I bought this place in a spot I'll call, in quote, Whispering Pines, in quote, a name that promised a lot more tranquility than it actually delivered, because what they don in oppos, T tell you in the real estate brochure, is that some neighborhoods aren't in oppos. T governed by laws, they're governed by egos, and at the top of that food chain was a woman named Margaret Thorne. Margaret was an oppos. T just the HOA president. She was a self-appointed queen who treated the neighborhood bylaws like they were the Ten Commandments, and she had this unsettling way of appearing on your lawn the second a dandelion dared to sprout. The first time I met her, I was literally carrying the last box into my new house, dripping sweat, and she didn't in oppos. T offer A in quote, welcome in quote, or A in quote, can I help, in quote. She just pointed to my truck and told me that commercial-sized vehicles weren't in oppos. T allowed to be parked in the driveway for more than 4 hours. I just blinked at her, trying to process the level of pettiness it takes to stopwatch a guy moving into his own home, and I remember giving her this polite, tired smile, the kind you get to a child who's trying to explain something they don in oppos. T understand? And I told her in quote, Ma in oppos. I in oppos. Spent my life following orders that actually mattered, so I think I can handle a driveway rule. End quote. That was the exact moment I saw her eyes turn cold, and I realized right then that I hadn't in oppos. T just moved into a house. I'd moved into a private war zone where the weapon of choice was a fine and a citation. For the next 6 months, it was psychological warfare. I'd wake up to a yellow slip on my door for, in quote, non-conforming, in quote, porch furniture, or we'll get an email at 2 a.m. about my trash cans being visible from the street by a margin of 3 inches. It was ridiculous. Honestly, I just ignored most of it and paid the fines because I had the pension and the savings, and I didn't in oppos. T want the headache, but Margaret took my silence as a challenge to her authority. She started sending her, in quote, security team, in quote, to my house, which was really just 2 local guys she'd hired to act as her personal enforcers. A big, hulking guy named Brock, who looked like he'd failed the police academy entrance exam 3 times, and a younger, jittery kid named Kyle who had that dangerous mix of low confidence and high adrenaline. They'd roll by in a white SUV with a generic, in quote, security, in quote, decal on the side, staring at my house like they were scouting a target in Fallujah, and it would have been funny if it wasn't in oppos. T so pathetic. I tried to be the bigger man, I really did, but things hit a breaking point one Tuesday afternoon when I was just coming back from a run. My lungs were burning, my mind was miles away, and suddenly this SUV screeches to a halt right in front of my driveway, blocking me in. Brock jumps out, puffing his chest out in this tactical vest that was definitely 3 sizes too small, and Kyle follows him, looking like he's about to jump out of his own skin. Brock starts barking at me about, in quote, unauthorized modifications, in quote, to my backyard fence. Mind you, I just replaced a rotten board, and he tells me they have the right to enter the property to inspect it. I felt that old familiar hum in the back of my brain, that shift from, in quote, civilian neighbor, in quote, to, in quote, operator, in quote, and I stepped into his personal space, just enough to let him smell the sweat and the lack of fear. And I told him very quietly that if he or his little sidekick set 1 foot past my property line without a warrant or a sheriff, they'd be leaving in something with sirens. Brock laughed this wet, arrogant sound and said, in quote, we're the law in Whispering Pines, buddy. Margaret says you're a problem, and we fix problems, end quote. I didn't in oppos. T say another word, I just walked past them, went inside and locked the door, but I knew that wasn't oppos. T the end, because men like that, men who find their only sense of power in a cheap plastic badge and a vest, they can end oppos. T let A, in quote, no, in quote, go unpunished. The actual incident happened 3 days later, and it's a blur of high-definition memory that I still play back in my head when the house gets too quiet. I was walking back from the local hardware store, carrying a small bag of screws, just enjoying the sun, when I heard the roar of that SUV engine again. This time they didn't into oppos. T just blocked me. They swerved onto the sidewalk, forcing me to jump back, and they both piled out with a level of aggression that told me they'd spent the morning getting hyped up on Margaret's rhetoric. Brock was red-faced, screaming about, in quote, disrespect, in quote, and in quote, fines, in quote, and how I was going to, in quote, learn my place, in quote. But it was Kyle I was watching, because his hand was shaking and he was reaching for something on his hip. In my world, you learn to read a man and oppos' intentions before he even knows them himself, and I saw Kyle's knuckles turn white as he gripped the handle of the pistol. Not a taser, not a pepper spray can, but a real, blacked-out semi-automatic. He drew it, his hands trembling so much the barrel was dancing in the air, and he pointed it right at my chest, screaming for me to, in quote, get on the ground, in quote. Now, anyone else would have been terrified, and rightfully so, but when you've had AK-47s fired at you from 20 feet away, a nervous kid with a handgun feels less like a threat and more like a problem to be solved. I felt my hands go behind my back, sliding under my loose shirt to the grip of my own Glock 19, which I carried every single day, not because I was looking for a fight, but because I knew people like this existed. I kept my voice low like I was talking to a stray dog, and I said, in quote, Kyle, you need to look at me. You're about to make a mistake that you can in oppos. T undo. Put the gun down and walk away, and we can pretend this was just a really stupid argument. End quote. Brock stepped up next to him, egging him on, yelling, end quote, yeah, show him who's in charge. He thinks he's special. End quote. And that was the trigger, literally and figuratively. Kyle's eyes went wide. He started to squeeze the trigger, and in that split second, the world slowed down into that beautiful, terrifying stillness where everything is clear. I didn't oppos. T think I just moved. I drew, leveled, and fired 3 rounds in less than 2 seconds. One to the shoulder to spin him, one to the thigh to drop him, and the third clipped the frame of his weapon, sending it skittering across the asphalt. Kyle went down with a scream that sounded more like a surprised yelp, and Brock just froze, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. He tried a lung at me, pure meat-headed instinct, and I sidestepped him, caught his arm, and used his own momentum to drive him face-first into the side of his SUV. I heard his ribs snap, that dry, branch-breaking sound, and I pinned him there with a knee in his back, my Glock still held at the low ready, scanning the street to make sure there was an oppos. A third player in this idiocy. Neighbors were starting to peek out of their windows. Some were recording on their phones, and I just stood there, breathing steadily, waiting for the inevitable sirens. When the actual sheriff's deputies arrived, they didn't end oppos. Find a frantic scene. They found a guy in a t-shirt and shorts standing calmly over 2 bleeding, in quote, security guards, in quote, with his weapon holstered and his hands visible. Sheriff Miller, a guy who'd seen enough to know a professional when he saw one, didn't end oppos. T even put me in cuffs at first. He just looked at the fake badges, looked at Kyle's gun on the ground, and looked at me, and he just sighed and said, in quote, Margaret Thorne is going to be the death of this county in oppos, as budget, end quote. The fallout was like a dam breaking. Once the police started digging, they found out that Margaret hadn't end oppos. T just been, in quote, strict, end quote. She'd been embezzling HOA funds to pay Brock and Kyle under the table, essentially running a private gang to extort homeowners. The, end quote, security company, end quote, wasn't oppos. T licensed, wasn't an oppos. T insured, and was basically just a shell for her to play out some weird queen bee fantasy. Kyle ended up with a shattered femur and a permanent limp, not to mention 5 years for aggravated assault and impersonating an officer. And Brock's ribs never quite healed right, leaving him with a chest deformity that serves as a nice little souvenir of the day he tried to bully the wrong guy. As for Margaret, she tried to flee to her sister's place the night the warrants were issued, but they caught her at a gas station 3 towns over. She got 18 months for solicitation of assault and a massive laundry list of financial crimes, and she's barred from ever holding a position of authority in a residential community again. The neighborhood is actually quiet now, the way I wanted it, and every time I walk past that spot on the sidewalk, I don an oppos. Feel angry, I just feel a little bit of pity for people who think that power comes from a gun or a title. But I've got to ask you guys because the comments on the local news were a total mess. Some people said I should have just run away or called the cops while they were threatening me. Like you could just pause a guy with a gun while you dial 911. And others said I was too hard on them, that I should have, in quote, de-escalated, in quote. More. Me? I think when you draw a weapon on a man in his own neighborhood, you've forfeited your right to a polite conversation. What would you have done? Would you have stayed calm? Or is there a point where the, end quote, neighborly, end quote, thing to do is to finally fight back? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to see where the line is for you guys.